Good evening, Hadley Wood, and welcome back to HWJC Live. Tonight, we have with us Kenny Wax, who is, as many of you know, a wonderful guy, wonderful member of our community. And just a bit of background to Kenny. Most of you would have read the short bio that I put on the poster. But Kenny has just finished a 3.5-year term as president of the Society of London Theatre. We'll hear more about that shortly. It's the trade organisation for the West End theatre industry. And he is one of the most prolific of a younger generation of producers. Just, as an example, during Christmas of 2019, he had 5 productions running concurrently in the West End. There is so much more we can say about Kenny, but I'm not going to bore you with the details myself. I'll let Kenny say more about himself. Kenny, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And can I just say that just to see that countdown made the whole, even before we start, that's just made the whole thing worthwhile. It was so dramatic.
Kenny, maybe I should take some tricks from you as to how to make things even more exciting, but thank you for that. So before we get, into the deep into what you do and how you do it, can you give us some background as to how you got involved in the theatre industry?
Yes.
And also some background about yourself as well, actually, where you come from, where you grew up. Nice to know about you.
So many will know I was Manchester born and bred, but
is that United or City?
Sorry?
Is that United or City?
Oh, I was definitely on the blue side, definitely on the City side. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I went to a grammar school, which was called William Hume's Grammar School, but at 16, I left to do my A-levels at Carmel College, which was pretty much the only full-time Jewish boarding school in the country at the time. And since then, very sadly, it's closed down, which is very sad to everybody who's ever been there, because it was an incredible experience. And I can honestly say I would have never gone into the theatre business had I not have had the opportunities that I had at Carmel, which included public speaking, being in the school play, even in captaining the football teams and the school teams, which I loved. And having left Carmel with reasonable A-levels, I went to the Polytechnic of Central London, where I did a business studies degree. And that was a 4-year course. And the 3rd year was a placement year. And I did try to get a job in the theatre industry. And I went for a few interviews and I didn't manage to snag anything. But the other kind of interest for me at the time was potentially going into retail personnel. And I got a job at the head office in Edgware for Dixon's, which was run at the time. It was a big family firm at the time, run by Stanley Carms. And I got a flat in from the JC, sharing with a very nice chap who was going to get married a year later. So he had one small bedroom to rent, and I joined the Mill Hill synagogue community, which were very generous and kind to me. And actually that year was fascinating because it wasn't a great year at Dixon's. I didn't feel that I learned very much, and particularly it was probably the thing that ultimately made me say to my parents at the end of that year, Mum and Dad, I really think I would like to give it a go in the theatre industry. And the difficult thing for them was that my brother, who's 5 years older than me, was very academic, and he'd been to Oxford, Balliol College, Oxford, studied English, done tremendously well. And he'd also, 5 years earlier, gone into the theatre industry as a director. We might talk about directors and producers a little bit later, but he'd had a really tough time. Just found it very hard. And so to have a second son, the one that was potentially a little bit more commercially minded, saying, well, I'm going to give it a go too, was probably quite disappointing in a way, quite worrying for them. But I do remember a very genuine and tearful conversation with my parents, particularly my dad, when I said, look, I'd really love to give this a go for a year and see if I can just kind of get my foot in the door. I mean, I didn't know anyone because my brother had made very few inroads, to be honest. Right. And he said, well, look, he'd studied as a lawyer and also qualified an accountant, and ended up running a small family business in Manchester, which he would have loved me to go into. And it was hard for me to choose this, but he very generously said, I never really took a risk in my professional life, and I'd really, really very happy to support you for a year and kind of see how you get on. And the sad thing is that they never really lived to see my moderate success, let's say, because both of them died. My dad 13, 14 years ago, my mum about 9 years ago. And actually, for those of you who I know, some of you will have seen one of my productions, Top Hat, in the end. My mum even died about 7 or 8 months before Top Hat ever made it to the stage. So although she knew it was happening, she never got to see it. So that's a real kind of sadness in my life that, you know, parents love to have you know, to have the
to be able to get knuckers from their
knuckers of their kids, and mine never did. But maybe they're looking down.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say they might have, you know, special seats at the shows even now. Fascinating. And you know, I was going to ask then. You mentioned that your brother gave you a year. Does that mean that after a year he saw how successful you were becoming, or you had some ups and downs along the way?
No, so sorry, but it was my dad.
Your dad. Yes, yeah.
I just kind of literally got my foot in the door. I started out as an usher. Some of you will have seen the 1989 production of Miss Saigon with Jonathan Pryce as the engineer and Leia Salonga as Kim, based on the Madame Butterfly story. And I got a job as an usher just as the show was opening. So I was there for about the first few months. Learned a bit, met some people, and managed to put a letter into the hand of Cameron Mackintosh, who was probably in his late 40s at the time, was already a tremendously successful producer around the world. And it said, you know, I want to be a producer. Could you give me some advice? Maybe you've got a job for me. And he incredibly generously allowed me to make an appointment, which I did. And 2 or 3 months later, I went to see him in his office, and we had an hour and a half talking about musicals, almost like children, just kind of exchanging stories. And he said, look, I haven't got anything for you in the office, but if I did, it wouldn't be the right thing. He said, if you're serious about this, you've got to really find out about the West End. I'd never worked on a West End show. He said, you've got to work in all aspects of the theatre industry over the next few years, really get stuck in and learn what the industry is about. And I very much followed that path. And so for 2 or 3 years, I worked backstage on shows. I did the follow spotting, which is holding one of those big lights from the very top of the gantry, pointing the lights on. So I did that at Cats. I worked in a box office. I worked on the fly floors. The flies, for anyone who's been backstage at the theatre, are those endless rows of ropes that are down the side of the theatre. Most modern theatres have flies, and flies are run on counterweight systems because the very big pieces of scenery can't be hauled in and hauled out from above. They're too heavy. So those pieces of scenery have to be counterweighted, so that actually all the flyman needs to do is just let the ropes through until they get to the dead, but the flyman isn't taking the weight, he's just kind of monitoring it going through. Anyway, I wasn't very good at any of these things, by the way, but it was a huge thrill. I said I worked at Cats. I remember the first
it sounds like you were very, very committed to this. It sounds like you wouldn't let it get your way.
I pressed the button which revolved the theatre. Cats was at the New London Theatre, and the whole of the theatre, the auditorium, was on a circular revolve. That's not just the stage, but it was the front 8 rows of the audience. And the first day I was underneath the stage with this button, and you hear it on your headphones, go. You press go, and the whole thing turns around. It was a huge thrill. I can tell you the stage crew, the other members of the stage crew, they must have hated me, because here came someone that was so excited to be there. And most of them, as you probably know, when people are in long-term, rather to them perhaps dead-end jobs, regarded this kind of young kid with eyes wide open to be a nightmare. But anyway, I had a fantastic
do you have
time.
any? I thought that was going to be a horror story, but do you have any horror stories, by the way, when you first started out, or everything seemed to run quite smoothly?
There was a very quick one at Cats, which I the magical Mr. Mistopheles used to come in from the flies, kind of on a rope, and it was one of the first times I'd ever done this on my own, and I just took too much tension, so I basically stopped him about 10 foot off the ground, and he had to jump down. Well, he was an acrobat and a dancer, so for him this was quite an exciting moment and something a little bit different. But there was a big inspection of why it hadn't worked, and I just kind of kept quiet and stayed in the background. But no, it took me 3 or 4 years to kind of make any progress. I was a foot messenger for an advertising agency, theatre advertising agency, and I walked my way around the West End and walked into all the big producers' offices. Bill Kenwright, Cameron Mackintosh, Really Useful. For those of you who remember, Really Useful was Andrew Lloyd Webber's company before he renamed it to LW Theatres. And there was a certain young man working at Really Useful at the time called Edward Windsor. who of course is Prince Edward. Prince Edward used to work for Andrew Lloyd Webber, and quite frequently I had to take packages and letters up to Prince Edward with Edward Windsor on the up in the lift up to the theatre and deliver this. So
you never met him himself though, did you?
No, absolutely. I met him.
You did?
I've met him since, and I've met other royals and prime ministers and presidents.
We're going to talk about that soon. I think that's going to be one of my next questions on the list. So we've heard a bit about your background in theatre, or not actually how you got to theatre. And I must say, you really personify where there's a will, there's a way. It sounds like you really did not let anything get in your way, and you had the will. So you just ploughed on. That's
one step that I've missed. So I got a job at the King's Head Theatre in Islington,
right,
as an administrator, which was kind of paid. I think I just looked at funny enough, I was going through some papers the other day. I think it was paid at about £100 a week or something in those days. And it said cash in hand, which of course is completely illegal, but that was a pub theatre. And there I produced some Sunday night concerts, like what we're talking about 120 seat theatre. And from producing little Sunday night concerts, I started to produce kind of one UK tour with a couple of celebs from the telly, a thriller that went out around the country and toured. And so you kind of build up a experience and knowledge by doing it. Really, that really is the only thing.
It sounds like in this type of industry, that's what you really need. It's the experience rather than the theory. You got to just be there on the ground and see how it all works. So then you've also, as I mentioned at the beginning, you just finished a 3.5-year presidency, right, of the Society of London Theatre. Can you just tell us a bit, about what is this Society of London Theatre? Who are they? What do they do? And what was your role as president?
Sure. So the Society of London Theatre is the trade organisation, which is on behalf of its members, which champions the theatre and the performing arts. And the membership, because it's the Society of London Theatre, is every general manager, producer and theatre. So you're talking about the National Theatre, the Royal Opera House, the Coliseum, the Barbican. You're talking about the not-for-profit, so theatres like the Almeida, the Royal Court, the Donmar Warehouse. Plus, you're also talking about all of the major theatre companies. So that's Andrew Lloyd Webber's, LW Theatres, Really Useful, Cameron Mackintosh, Bill Kenwright, Ambassadors Theatre Group, David Pugh. So they're all members of this one trade organisation. SALT, Society of London Theatre, acronym SALT, has about 50 full-time staff. You asked on our pre-chat, how could I possibly manage well, I didn't manage 50 because we have a chief executive.
Right.
But the chief executive and the staff are still responsible to the members because it's a members organisation and we pay our dues. So those staff provide advice on legal and general management and employment relation matters, which you can imagine with a workforce of thousands and thousands across London, there's always bits and pieces coming up. We manage the process of collective bargaining, which is with the various entertainment unions, which is the Musicians Union and Equity and BEC2, which is all the backstage staff. And these can be really kind of long, difficult, acrimonious negotiations. These books of agreements run about 3 years and then you revisit them again, and quite often they go to ACAS, the conciliation service, because you can't get to an agreement. We want to play on Sundays, but the Musicians Union want to be paid triple time for us to play on a Sunday, so it makes it really not worthwhile to actually open the show on a Sunday. So there's a kind of there's lots of discussions about that sort of thing. And we also provide a range of commercial services and marketing services. So if anyone's ever booked a ticket through TKTS, which is the half price ticket booth, that's run by SALT. The theatre tokens, if anyone's bought a gift as a token. There are things like Kids Week and Get Into London Theatre, which are particular marketing promotions throughout the year. And then, excitingly for me, there's the Olivier Awards, which are the kind of centrepiece, the showcase really for the industry, our version of the Oscars or the BAFTAs really. And so I've had the great pleasure of addressing an audience of 6,000 at the Royal Albert Hall on 2 occasions. Unfortunately, this year it didn't happen because of COVID, it was cancelled. But twice I've kind of held court for 6 minutes and done my introductory and welcome speech to all the, lords and ladies and royalty that have been there, just on my own on stage at the Royal Albert Hall. So quite daunting.
You're terrified.
On an auto cue, which is, if you've never used a proper auto cue before, that took some. Actually, there's a terrific app on the mobile phones which can just get you used to reading off a scrolling page.
Hey, that's cool.
Yes, it's a hugely busy organisation. It was a great honour to do it. I thought I didn't think I'd ever be asked, and it is voted for, but I was voted in without anybody standing against me, which was again a great honour.
Mm. So coming back to what I said, we're going to come back to. I'm sure you've met some rather interesting and famous people. I'm sure you have, as you mentioned already. Does any in particular stand out? You know, who can you talk about who really stands out above the rest that you've met?
I think it's always interesting, isn't it, to meet somebody of your child from your kind of childhood that you've absolutely revered. So these aren't necessarily the most famous people, but when I was growing up, there was a program on television that some will remember called Happy Days. Happy Days, the leading character was the Fonz, and the Fonz was played by Henry Winkler. So I got to meet Henry Winkler 2 or 3 years ago. And another thing that I watched, you know, every Saturday night with my parents, of course, once Shabbat had gone out, was Starsky and Hutch. And I became quite close with David Soul, who played Hutch in Starsky and Hutch. And in fact, he married one of my friends through me because they met on a job. I think she was about the fourth wife, but they have been married for 20 years, and she's tremendous support for him. But, you know, bigger names, people like Anthony Hopkins, Damian Lewis.
What's it like meeting those people, by the way, the ones you've always dreamed about? Is there a bit of an anticlimax when you finally get to see who they are? Or is it
the difference between meeting somebody? It depends on what terms. So, I mean, I met President Bush Sr., George Bush Sr., who came to Top Hat, and he came with his wife and with John Major and his wife. So a president and a prime minister in the same kind of small reception room with myself, and one of the actresses came, and we had 15 minutes with them, and that was lovely. Anthony Hopkins was many years ago. We were doing an event for Prince Charles. We were launching Air Studios, which was a new recording studios in Hampstead, but it was going to be celebrating the starting of the Prince's Trust. And we were in a room, and it was we did Dylan Thomas's Under Milk Wood. So every famous Welsh person that there ever was that was alive was in that room. Harry Seacombe, Catherine Zeta-Jones, Tom Jones, but Anthony Hopkins was there. And the amazing thing about Anthony Hopkins, and when I say I worked with him, I never really worked with Anthony Hopkins, but he did come around the room one at a time, introducing himself to all of us Noch Schleppers. Hello, I'm Anthony Hopkins. Very nice to meet you. So that was quite a big thrill too. But yeah, some musicians. Brian May of Queen. I produced a tour of a Brian May concert, which was fun. I produced David Essex in an Andrew Webber show, Aspects of Love. Marty Pellow, Wet, Wet, Wet. Some of our members might know. He had that huge #1 hit with, I think it was I Feel It in My Fingers, I Feel It in My Toes, whatever that was called. Barry Manilow I met a few times. He was doing some work in London, and we worked on his stage show of Copacabana. So also,
I'm doing a great job at pretending I know all the names that you've just mentioned over here, but some do.
Too young, actually, Rabbi, but I think the members will.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm sure everyone watching will have.
Oh, here's one that here's one more. We had an incredible experience, because in the early days of The Play That Goes Wrong, which we might talk about a bit later, somebody walked through the door off the street on their own, hadn't booked a ticket, looked at the front of house at the slogans and said, I fancy going to see this. He bought a ticket. He was called J.J. Abrams. I didn't even know the name at the time, but J.J. Abrams turned out to be the producer of Star Wars.
Oh, wow.
Current series of Star Wars. And he loved the show, and he became a co-producer of The Play That Goes Wrong when it opened in New York on Broadway. But to get to know us after, because I wasn't there the night that he went to see the show. That often happens. I'm at home with my doting family. He bought his ticket, went to see the show, and then his lawyer agent called to say, my client is interested in meeting you. Would you be, he'd love to bring the show to New York. I said, well, where should we meet? He said, come to the set of Star Wars. Later, my co-producer and myself were being vetted for cameras, and all that was taken off us. And there we met Harrison Ford. We met Daisy Ridley, who became the new young female star. We met Harrison Ford's double, who looked exactly the same as him, so that was quite interesting. And I also met Chewbacca, who, again, if anyone's ever seen Star Wars, he's the big hairy one, kind of looks half lion, half dog.
Yeah, I know you're talking about, yeah.
A large kind of 7-foot Norwegian actor. But we were literally on the set of Star Wars watching all of this happening with stormtroopers rushing around. So that was an incredible experience. So it's been an
exciting life. I'm in the wrong industry over here. So Kenny, I don't know how you're still smiling, given everything that's going on. COVID has massively affected your industry, over and above many other industries, actually. You've completely shut since March, I believe. So why are you still smiling? And, where is the light at the end of this tunnel?
I think I've just got to say, when you do something for as long as I have been doing it, since 1989, you get very used to the letdowns. You get knocked a lot. People disappoint. It's a very creative industry. It relies very much on creative people. And it's never a surprise when kind of the worst thing happens. But nobody could have possibly expected this. I was actually in New York. In fact, I was at a meeting in New York with all the New York producers on the day that they literally shut Broadway. And incredibly, this was in March. I think it was March the 16th, if I remember, might be out by a day or two. But it was the very day that Six, one of my current shows, was going to open on Broadway that night. We had about a $350,000 party at a huge restaurant 5 hours later, with the show about to happen. The show was at 6 o'clock. This meeting was between 12 and kind of 1:30, and the mayor of New York shut the town. And I was texting my American co-producer on the other side of the room saying, shouldn't we just ask them just if we could just get the show open? We'd been doing 4 weeks of previews, which had been pretty much sold out. And it soon dawned on us that actually that was completely the wrong thing to do. What we should be doing is going along with everything, putting the party on ice, which they did. The restaurant were very generous to us, and actually being the first show to reopen rather than the last show to open. Because being the last show to open in a pandemic wouldn't have got us very many points. So I mean, we shut down 7 productions of Six the Musical. We had London, UK tour, New York, Chicago, 2 Norwegian cruise line, huge ocean liners, and the production that just finished at Sydney Opera House and was on its way to Melbourne. God. So we had 7 productions of Six. We had Play That Goes Wrong, Magic Goes Wrong, Comedy About a Bank Robbery, which were my 3 other West End shows at the time, and a whole bunch of kid shows and touring shows. And the funny thing about all of these shows, Rabbi, is that they're all kind of mid-scale. It's not Phantom or Les Mis or Hamilton. These are all quite kind of modest-sized productions. I have done the bigger show. Top Hat was a bigger show. Some of my touring musicals were bigger shows. But these shows being mid-scale meant that we could, in theory, try and get them back on with the dreaded social distancing, which we're living with at the moment. And so actually we have just been permitted to open with social distancing now that London is in tier 2. So Six will open next weekend. And
let's hear a bit about, actually, before we talk about Six reopening, let's hear a bit about you. I know you're very proud of Six, and rightly so. How, what is Six? Where did it start from, and why are you so proud of it? Tell us a bit about that.
Well, it's lovely to discover new and young talent. I think a few of the members of the community saw, I know not everybody loved it as part of an acquired taste, but The Play That Goes Wrong, which also was a discovery of a bunch of kids from drama school that set up their own production company. And so even just before Six, Play That Goes Wrong has been performed in 35 countries around the world. It's played on every continent. It's played on Broadway, off Broadway, toured Australia, toured the UK, played in the West End. So it's fabulous to kind of make something out of almost nothing. And just like Play That Goes Wrong, I saw Six as a student production at Cambridge University. The writers had just done the show at the Edinburgh Festival, but not in a big, grand, fabulous space, in a tiny little room that they'd booked, because Cambridge University didn't really have, apparently the drama side didn't have any money. So I went to see Six in October, just after they'd come back from Edinburgh at the end of August. They put a showcase on of 3 or 4 more performances. And I actually took my daughter Jemima, because I thought that'd be quite interesting for her to give me a younger person's perspective. And I just found that it was thrillingly inventive, exciting, original. So it's a pop concert musical based on the 6 wives of Henry VIII telling their version of the story. Sounds absolutely ridiculous. Nobody could ever imagine that this could possibly be a stage show, but then nobody could have ever imagined that, Cats could be a stage show. So, or Starlight Express, Trains on Roller Skates, these are kind of theatrical legends, really.
And
But
that's
six,
the entire cast, just these 6 wives of Henry.
6 women on stage, but think of them as the Spice Girls. I know they're a bit out of your time, but Little Mix, kind of modern contemporary pop stars telling the story in a kind of modern vernacular. There's no Henry. And again, part of the excitement of creating this is that many people said in those first few months as we developed the show, oh, you must write a second act, you must introduce Henry, you must write some more songs. It was only 75 minutes long, and we really felt, and we stayed quite firm, that we thought that in its creation it was short, but it was for the Netflix generation, where apparently concentration spans are shorter. I don't know if you've watched anybody now in the first 27 minutes of this conversation, but perhaps was talking to a slightly older community than the Netflix generation. But yeah, it's been a great journey. These 2 kids very, very bright out of Cambridge University have absolutely hit the jackpot. 6 could be playing in every country in the world right now, but we are precious with our rights, so we don't want to license too much too soon. So we'll be back on Broadway hopefully in perhaps July or August next year, back on the cruise ships. Australia will resume. London, I just said, is about to restart. Manchester, unfortunately, where the touring production is in Salford, is gone into Tier 3. So I had a very awkward conversation last week because we had 2 companies of 6. So yes, you're right, 6 actresses, but then there's also 3 or 4 understudies. The support group is about 25. There's a company about 25 for each of those 2 shows. So the 2 companies in 2 rooms next to each other, one getting the news that they were opening, and the other company is getting the news that they weren't opening. And that was very tricky. They'd had, for instance, they'd all had 3 tests that week, 3 COVID tests. I actually had one, my first one myself. Part of the thing is that we need to keep them very safe. And we give them lots of protocols, and they've been excellent actually. So
given that theatres are reopening, and as you've mentioned, how can you reassure people, especially our listeners, our viewers, that it's safe to come back? I mean, I struggle with this, trying to tell people it's safe to come back to shul. So you've got the similar job of telling people it's safe to come back to the theatre. How do you do that, and why should people come back?
Listen, at the end of the day, we want everyone to be safe, and it's got to be everybody's personal choice. But a huge amount of work that I've been very involved with on behalf of the Society of London Theatre has been the deep dive into the real science of this, because there was a time that they were saying, well, singing is dangerous. In fact, we know that singing was kind of not positively looked on in shuls, but actually we said, on what basis are you making that statement? And actually, when they did the scientific testings, which came in August, they should have been doing these in kind of April. Right. It was August until the scientific testings were done. And they said both singing and the playing of brass and woodwind, anything which was blowing into an instrument, shofar would be the same. Anything which spittle would create, the blowing would create spittle, would potentially kind of cause, danger. And in fact, they decided that, having done the test, that there was no danger.
Really? Doesn't it create what's it called? I'm forgetting that word now. Okay, I'll come back to it in a second. Aerosols, that's what it is. Aerosols. There we go.
You wouldn't stand in the way. So using the shofar or the trumpet, you wouldn't stand in front of the trumpet. But if you were playing a trumpet or blowing a shofar, as long as there was a radius of 1.5 to 2 meters, that would be safe. And obviously in a pit orchestra, you would have a distance between a trumpet because it's such a loud instrument. And
are you seeing a resurgence in people who want to come back? Are you
definitely since the announcement of Tier 2. But things like contactless ticketing, one-way systems through the theatre. So obviously contact ticket, where you're not sent a paper ticket and it's scanned. Everybody gets a temperature check on their way into the building. You're told to come at a little particular time, which might be at 10-minute intervals, so you're not got everybody arriving and departing at the same time. People going particularly down aisles, and actually Nika Burns, who's a tremendous force of nature, she owns the NIMAX theatres. She was also previously a president of the Society of London Theatre, so she owns 6 of the theatres, and we're in 3 of those theatres, and she's respaced all of the stall seats to make sure it's 1 meter plus. Because if it's like 0.95 and it's measured nose to nose, so I can't quite touch your nose because you're in a different part of the screen, but we look like we're very close to each other, but 1 meter nose to nose, everybody facing forward, everybody in masks. Wider rows means that to get to your seats, you're not kind of on top of people. They're discouraging any bringing of bags, large rucksacks, suitcases should all be checked in outside, at the cloakroom. Nobody's kind of squeezing down rows with bags. So we really do feel we can create a safe environment.
That's an interesting one, that nose to nose. I've never heard that one before. It sounds like the type of thing I would have, been studying in yeshiva. The halakhic technicalities of the different laws. This is quite technical.
That was the 1 meter plus that's been quite controversial.
And it goes nose to nose. Fascinating. Yeah. Makes sense, because you're worried about the the stuff getting to other people's nose.
But also, of course, with social distancing, we're seating people in their own bubbles. So when people say to me, well, how many seats can you get in the Lyric Theatre? I say, I know how many seats there are, but I've got no idea what our capacity is, because every night it will be different. Because my view is that everybody will come in groups of 6, because then it will only leave 1 seat in between each 6. If everybody books in 1s and 2s, you've got 5 more empty seats for the social distancing. So although you're with your family together, there is an empty seat either side of you, and the less empty seats, the better.
Interesting. I'm sure the box seats are quite popular these days. Then there's
I don't realise, but they are absolutely the best seats to buy. You're quite right.
Little plug over there. Okay, so I actually, looking at the time, it's crazy. The first time I've ever gone over time over here. I just wanted to end. I guess there's a few more things I wanted to say, but let's just choose one of my last questions over here. Can you tell us some new projects on the horizon? And we'll finish with that. Finish on something exciting, and hear about what there's to look forward to in the future.
We have quite a few things in the pipeline. I went to the Edinburgh Festival, I think 18 months ago, saw a crazy show with no dialogue from a French company called Fishbowl, about 3 individuals living in almost like kind of like a tenement block down a corridor. Very physical theatre, a little bit similar to kind of Play That Goes Wrong. So we're going to bring them over to start that off sometime in the next year. My kind of big 2 projects, we're doing the first ever.
I think we've all felt like we've been in fish, very.
I can
relate to that. I can relate.
We are doing the first commercial tour, and hopefully back into the West End, of Bugsy Malone, which many will know from the famous movie musical of, I think, the 1970s or maybe 80s with Jodie Foster. So there was a fabulous production at the Lyric Hammersmith about 5 years ago, and that's the production we're going to take out on tour. And the biggest single production that I've got coming up is based on a book by Eric Kastner, who was a fabulous German author who also wrote the Emil and the Detective stories in the 1950s. He wrote a lot for children. He was interviewed many times by the Gestapo, who didn't like this kind of positive, non-Nazi viewpoint that he had, a children's author. But he wrote a book that became very famous, Das Lotti Lottchen, which I think in Das Duper Lottchen, which is the two Lotties. The two Lotties became the movies of The Parent Trap, of which there was one with Hayley Mills in the 1960s, and there was one with Lindsay Lohan in the 1990s. The 2 movies were made by Disney. The same story was told. They were updated. Very, very popular. And the gag is that 2 children come from parents who divorce when they're babies, and one of the mother takes the child to Vienna and to Munich, I beg your pardon, and the father takes the daughter to Vienna, where they both lead their lives. And 9 years later, the 2 children meet at a summer camp, not knowing of each other's existence, and they realise that something's afoot here. And when they say, "Well, when were you born?" The same day in the same hospital, and they decide, because they know their parents will never allow them to be together, because they decide to swap places, change their clothes, change their hairstyle, and go to meet their parents.
Okay, that's cool. That's cool.
Now, when you're making a movie or a TV program, you can do that very easy with trick photography. It's been done many times before. In the stage show, we've had to spend the last 2 years auditioning identical twins of 9 and 10 years old.
Oh gosh, yeah.
So that's been really exciting. We have a fantastic director, Trevor.
I'm sure you're making sure that there's a good amount of seats reserved for the Hadleywood Jewish community.
I'm sure, and I don't know if Leonie's on, but I know she likes her musicals, Leonie. So if you're there, that's definitely one for you. You can be my guest of honor. And that's very exciting. It's possibly still, we're going to hopefully do it this summer. Trevor Nunn.
Again, I wish you the best of luck.
And many hugely ran the
I lied about that being the last question, actually. There was one thing I wanted to, that we'll literally finish with this, but it's been so fun talking to you and hearing your story. It's fascinating. I wanted to know, it's a slightly different question, actually, but How has being Jewish had any, effect on the way that you operate in terms of the theatre industry? Has it made any difference? Do you find that the sort of Jewish values can have some sort of element to play over there, or is it just totally disconnected one from the other?
Well, I would say nobody, on my SALT board, Society of London Theatre board, would be in any doubt that I'm Jewish. I don't go out to see shows on Friday night. I don't mix off. I'll always say, no, it's my Sabbath and I'm at home with my family on that night, and I'm very kind of clear about that. And we're not the most observant, but we do always have that family meal. And I think it's just very important that people do see one as an ethical producer, and if they can then join that up with my Jewish principles. And I think that it's a very crazy industry. There's lots of shenanigans that go on. I think perhaps possibly one of the reasons I was asked to stand for the president and went unopposed was because I perhaps am considered to have very good ethics and morals, and there's no skeletons in the closet, because there's a lot of bullying in the industry. There's very few opportunities for people of colour, which we're very much working on. And I have people of colour in my office now, and it's something that we're very keen to do, to encourage minorities to have opportunities where there just weren't any. So I think it's a very good question, and I'd like to think that people would be very sure that this Jewish man, lived and worked with principled ethics.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and thank you so much again for giving of your time to join us. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, Kenny. Wishing you the best of luck with everything in the future, with reopening, with Six, with all your future endeavors. And looking forward. If
anyone knows any people who've got identical girls of about 8 or 9, please pass them my way.
Okay, fine. We'll spread the word, Kenny. We'll spread the word. Thank you so much. Wishing you a fantastic night and a great week ahead.
Thanks very much. Bye, everybody. Lovely to see you.
To everyone else watching, thank you so much for joining us again. Next week, Sunday night, same time, same place. Still waiting on confirmation from our special guest, but we will have someone very special on here. Sorry for the going over time tonight, but I'm sure you'll agree with me that it was well worth it, well worth hearing from our dear Kenny, and wishing everyone a fantastic and joyous week ahead.